Okay, so today we're going to continue talking about classes and constructors for a class. And I'm going to show an example of the fact that in Java you can have multiple constructors for the same class. And those constructors can be specialized to accept different amounts of arguments. And we'll talk about why you might want to do that. So I've created I think it's mostly blank here. Well, no, it's not blank. I should probably delete all of this. I'm creating a class called student. And a student, like imagine in Banner, right? All your information is there in Banner. Your name, your student ID, your GPA, whatever. So I've given this class called student three instance variables. Your name as a string, your student ID number, which I've just abbreviated SID, will be an integer. It could be a string, but I'm making it an integer. And your GPA, your grade point average, is a float. It's a double because it's going to be a decimal. And now I'm going to build the constructor for that class. The constructor is the method, the special method that you call to create a new instance of that class, a new object that is a student. And so since we have three instance variables in our class, we're going to have three parameters for that constructor. I like the convention, like if your variables are name, student ID, and GPA, I like the convention new name, new student ID, new GPA. Sometimes I'll do, and actually in the next example I'll do the same variables but lowercase. I might do something like my name, my student ID, my GPA, just something to distinguish the parameter that's passed to the constructor from the name of the variable itself. And there's yet another way to do that, which we'll maybe look at next week. So I'm handing this constructor three values, a name, an ID, and a GPA, and I'm putting them into those variables. Okay. So if I want to create a new student, I create a new student by typing something like, we'll just call the student 1. So we tell it that we're making a student. Student is the name of the class. The name of the variable that is a object of the student class we'll call student 1 equals new student. And this is actually calling the constructor of the student class. So since our constructor has three parameters, we need to pass it three values. We need a name, we need a student ID 678678, and we need a GPA 3.9. Okay, so this line of code creates a new student object called student 1 and passes it the appropriate parameters to put into those three instance variables. If I run it now, I probably won't get anything useful happening because I haven't created some way to print out that student's value. So let's create a print method here. Ignore everything but this because I've got this fully coded right now. We'll call the method print student, and its return type is void. It doesn't return anything, it just does stuff. And we'll system out print line the name plus the student ID and then GPA with some text in there as just to pretty things up. Okay, so I will come back to my program and I will say student 1, which is the name of my object, print student, which is the name of my method that belongs to the student class. Now when I run it, I should get, there you go. So my student's name is Jung Ho Ha, its student ID is 678678, his GPA is 3.9. So we have now a constructor that can take three parameters, put them into a new student. But suppose I want to also be able to create a blank student, an empty student. It used to be that I could do that by calling the default constructor by just leaving these blank. But now, but now that I've created this constructor, I can't do that anymore. I can't just call the default constructor from Java again. Let me show you that that is true for a second. It's not going to work because I've done something to okay. So let's try to create a student 2. Student 2 equals new student. Empty parameter list. Okay, that should, we saw this last time, just call what's called the default constructor that Java creates in the background. If you don't make a constructor, Java makes a constructor and just puts empty values in all the variables. We saw that with the album class in the last topic we did. If I run this now, I think I'll get an error. Yes. Cannot find symbol new student. That's because there's supposed to be a space there. That's just me being not careful. That's not the error I should have gotten. The error I should have gotten is this. Error, no suitable constructor found for student with no arguments. Constructor student.student string int double is not applicable to the format that I gave it. So once I create a constructor that takes parameters, Java won't let me call that default empty constructor anymore. If I want an empty constructor, I have to make it myself. So let's do that. I'm going to create a new constructor. And this is going to be a constructor with no parameters. Let me set this apart so you can see what I'm doing here. And I'm going to set this apart as well. Okay. There. So I'm going to create a new constructor called student, but this time with an empty parameter list. I'm not going to pass it anything. So this is the constructor that I'll call if I just want to create a student with default values. Maybe I'm creating a new student. I don't know their name yet, but I want this blank entry in my listing and banner. So I just give its name a default value. I'm going to call it test student. I'm going to give the student ID a default value of 100000. And I'll give every student a default GPA of 4.0 if I don't know their GPA. Okay. So now I have a second constructor for my class. I've got one that takes a bunch of parameters and creates a student with a name, an ID, and a GPA. And now I've got this one that just creates an empty student. And let's go back and make sure that student 2 works. So student 1, we create them, we call the print student. Student 2, we want to create them and then print their information. Okay, so I've got two students. I've printed their values. Student number 1 is the one whose name, ID, and GPA I gave to the first constructor. And student 2, notice that their name is test student, their student ID is the default student ID, their GPA is 4.0. So this calls the parameterless default constructor. Okay. But if I don't create that myself, Java won't create it for me. It will create it for me if I don't create, let me go back, if I don't create this fully parameterized constructor, this one that has things. So if I don't create any constructors, Java makes me a default one. If I do create constructors and I want a default one, I got to make my own default one. This process of having multiple methods that do the same thing but have different parameter lists is called overloading. So I would say that I've overloaded this constructor by having two versions of it. Okay, I've got one version with all the parameters. I've got the second version with no parameters, and it just puts default values into all of the fields, all of the instance variables. I could create another one that just takes some of the variables as parameters and puts generic default values in the others. Okay, let's look at that. Okay, suppose I want to be able to create a student that I know the student's name, but I want to give it the default student ID. I don't know why I changed this. The default ID I had before was 100000. Okay, I can create a constructor that just has one parameter, the name, and then it takes that parameter, puts it into the name, but then puts generic values that weren't passed to it into the student ID and the GPA. So now I have 3 different constructors. They're all called student, but they've all got different parameter lists. I can create a student by giving all 3 values. I can create a student by giving none of the values. And in this case, I can create a student by giving them just the name. Okay? Let's see how to do that. I'm going to create another student called student 3. Student 3 equals new student. If I just type this, I'll get another blank student. Let's print student 3's student 3 dot. We're calling the method called print student. No arguments to that. Okay. Let's run that. I should get 2 test students that are identical now. Oops, what have I done? Oh, I don't know why I like to leave that space out. Cannot find symbol student 3. Oh, it's because I misspelled student. I'm doing this really sloppy today. Little mistakes, that's fine. There we go. So now we've got the student 1, who I called the full constructor, student 2, who I called the empty constructor with no parameters, so it just puts default values into the names. Now let's call the 3rd constructor I created that only takes the name. Put that student's name in and call that student. And this student should have a name, but default values for their student ID and their GPA. And there you go. So here's the student who I gave all the information. Here's the student who I gave none of the information. And here's the student who I gave only the name and not the GPA. Okay? So when we create our classes, we can imagine situations where we might want to create an object of that class with all of the information. We might want to create an object of that class with no information, or specific blanks in that information, or somewhere anywhere in between. We might want to fill in part of the information in the class and leave out the rest and fill the rest with generic values. So in order to do that, we do what's called overloading the constructor. We create multiple versions of it, one with all the parameters, one with no parameters, and one with just part of the parameters. Notice that I've also got in this class at the very, very end, and I always put this at the end of my class, and that's just a convention that I like, the set and get methods. So I've got set methods for all 3 of the instance variables. And the other thing that I sometimes do, I'm not sure I did this in the last program, is because a set method and a get method is just one statement, I'll just put them on one line of code, and sometimes I'll space them out here to line them up really, really nicely. That's up to you. You can do your set methods. The more respectful way of indentation would be to do your set method like this. But they take up so much space in your program, especially if you've got a lot of instance variables. We've only got 3 here, but you can imagine if you've got a class with 15 instance variables, that's 15 set methods and 15 get methods. I just put them on one line like this, and that makes my code kind of tidy. What we will see in the next video I do, which is probably going to be kind of a long one, is that you can do this overloading with any method, not just constructors. You can have multiple versions of a method that accept different parameter lists and execute slightly different tasks depending on which parameters you choose to give that method from the outside, from your main program. The other thing to notice about this program, and I'm going to stress this a lot because it is really sort of what Java is all about. If we go to our student class here, our student class has a lot of stuff in it. It's got the definition. It's got 3 different constructors with different parameter lists. I can take some of this empty space out now. And it's got a print method to print out the student's information. And it's got set and get methods. It's got 82 lines of code. All that happens in my main program is creating objects, calling their methods. And if you're writing Java code the way it's meant to be written, that's really all that should be happening in your main program for the most part, is creating objects and then calling the methods of those objects. That's how Java is supposed to work. All of the action happens inside the objects, not in your main code. So your main code will often be very, very short. I've only got 19 lines of code here in my main program. 80 some lines of code inside my class. Okay, so what we'll do in the next example is we'll create a more complicated class, and we will look at overloading both the constructor and the methods of that class.